Tanzania's elections delivered Samia Suluhu Hassan a neat 97.66% win, while the AU and SADC politely frowned. African diplomacy at its finest. Meanwhile, across the continent, Donald Trump threatened Nigeria over Christian persecution, though savvy observers suspect the real stakes are oil, not faith. And in the diaspora, Zohran Mamdani, born in Kampala, now runs New York City at 34, showing that immigrants aren't just surviving, they're leading. From Dar es Salaam to Abuja to Queens, African politics keeps reminding the world power, satire, and audacity travel fast. So one always needs to slow down and get a second take. Welcome to the show. Tanzania. Land of Mount Kilimanjaro, Serengeti dreams, and election results so impressive they make North Korea look like an amateur startup. On October 29, 2025, the country once again performed that sacred African ritual called democracy, a ceremony where citizens line up, ballots are cast, observers take notes, and the ruling party wins by exactly the kind of margin that only divine intervention or well-trained arithmetic can deliver. President Samia Suluhu Hassan of the legendary Chama Pinduzi CCM secured a gentle, modest 97.66% of the vote. Because when you've done such a great job, why leave room for doubt? The official turnout was said to be 87%, which is impressive considering the opposition had been arrested, disqualified, and in some cases, disappeared. Your democracy is thriving when people risk dying just to abstain. The main opposition, Chadema, boycotted after their leader, Tundu Lissu, was charged with treason, proving that in Tanzania, speaking against the government isn't just rebellion, it's performance art. ACT Wazalendo's candidate was disqualified too, because you can't have elections which are cluttered with choices. That just confuses the voters. Post-election protests turned bloody, with opposition groups claiming around 700 deaths, while the UN confirmed at least 10, because international organizations prefer their numbers low and their adjectives diplomatic. The African Union arrived, as it always does, with its army of clipboards and cautious optimism. The AU election observation mission was led by former Botswana President Mokgweetsi Masisi. It's good to see him working after that hectic defeat to Duma Boko back home. 72 observers from 31 countries were deployed, which in Samia's math equals 72 people she hoped would be polite tourists taking notes while the real story happens off camera. Their preliminary report on November 5 declared the elections did not comply with AU principles, normative frameworks, and international obligations. In other words, it was a circus. The AU pointed out that Tanzania's 1977 constitution still forbids judicial review of presidential results, meaning once the winner is announced, God himself couldn't file an appeal. They also reminded everyone that reforms promised after the 2020 elections were about as real as campaign promises about power cuts. Opposition leaders were either jailed, exiled, or perhaps enjoying extended spa treatments in undisclosed locations. Ballot boxes were stuffed, observers were kicked out after 5 minutes, and journalists were treated like criminals for reporting anything other than victory speeches. The AU found that over 200 enforced disappearances had taken place since 2019, proving that in some parts of Africa, political engagement is literally a disappearing act. And of course, the internet shut down, because in modern elections, nothing says free and fair like turning off the Wi-Fi so no one can tell the difference. The AU concluded that Tanzania urgently needed constitutional reform, judicial empowerment, and inclusive dialogue, 3 things African governments typically define as treason, obstruction, and foreign interference. Now, The Southern African Development Community, SADC, decided to have its own look at Tanzania. The SADC mission, led by former Malawi Speaker Richard Mswoya, brought 80 people, 66 of whom were actual observers, and the rest, one assumes, were translators, bodyguards, and people making sure the air conditioning worked. Their verdict? The elections fell short of the requirements of the SADC principles and guidelines governing democratic elections. Translation: it was bad. Like even by our standards, bad. They diplomatically said voters could not express their democratic will, which sounds poetic until you realize it means the ballot boxes were doing all the talking. SADC noted systematic intimidation, arrests, misuse of state resources, and what they called an uneven playing field. That's generous. It's more like CCM had a Formula One car while everyone else was told to jog barefoot. Observers were harassed, interrogated, and even had their photos deleted. Counting was secretive, results unverifiable, and the internet blackout turned the whole process into a national guessing game. SADC praised the orderly pre-election environment, which is like congratulating a lion for not eating the antelope before the hunt begins. They recommended allowing independent candidates and including youth in politics, because if you can't vote for change, at least let the young people help count how hopeless it all is. It was SADC's strongest criticism since Zimbabwe 2023, which tells you how low the continental bar is, because once every 2 years, they seem to rediscover integrity. The AU and SADC reports were essentially two versions of the same breakup letter. Both said Tanzania's laws violated every charter ever signed in Addis Ababa or Gaborone. Both said opposition parties were treated like domestic terrorists. Both said the voting process was as transparent as a dirty mirror. And both ended with that polite African optimism: recommendations, consultations, and calls for dialogue, like prescribing herbal tea to a patient who's missing vital organs. What is interesting is that just days before those reports, AU Commission Chair Muhammad Ali Yusuf had already congratulated President Hassan on her victory and reaffirmed AU support for Tanzania's democratic institutions. It's the continental version of sending flowers to the crime scene. The AU has perfected this art of doublespeak. One branch writes scathing reports while the other sends congratulatory tweets. It's as if the AU believes democracy is like football. You can referee and cheer for the home team at the same time. Now, the rest of the world reacted to Tanzania the way you'd expect, with long sighs and short statements. Zimbabwe's president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, never one to miss an opportunity to endorse creative mathematics in an election, called Hassan's victory visionary leadership. Coming from him, that's practically a peer review. Uganda's Museveni, still running his own democracy on life support, congratulated her too, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit. Somalia's Hassan Sheikh Mohamud praised her resilience, which is African code for "you survived the scandal, sister." Even Qatar's Amir Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani chimed in, probably just to stay on everyone's good side before building another stadium for someone somewhere. Hassan's inauguration on November 3 was held under heavy military security at a base in Dodoma, breaking tradition by excluding civilians, because in modern Tanzania, even victory is classified. The guest list looked like a networking event for pragmatic regionalism. Zambia's Hakainde Hichilema, Mozambique's Daniel Chapo, Somalia's Hassan Sheikh, and Burundi's Evariste Ndayishimiye attended. Everyone else suddenly had something urgent to do. Kenya's Ruto was missing. Museveni was Not there, Kagame was mysteriously unavailable and Ramaphosa was probably preoccupied by more slander from Trump. The message was subtle, but clear. Tanzania's democracy had become contagious and no one wanted to catch it. But Zambia and Mozambique had no choice. They share borders and business with Tanzania. Zambia gets over half its imported fuel through Dar es Salaam. So Hichilema's attendance was less endorsement, more insurance policy. Mozambique's presence was about SADC solidarity and trade routes, because in regional politics, ethics travel economy class. You should know this. Analysts called it pragmatic diplomacy. We call it what it is. Mind your own pipeline politics. So what does this election tell us? CCM doesn't hold elections to test popularity. It holds them to remind everyone who's still in charge. The AU and SADC, meanwhile, play their assigned roles in the continental theater. They show up, they frown, they issue reports full of adjectives, and then they go home. Their recommendations will sit unread until the next election, when they'll be retyped with new dates and old promises. The international community will express concern, civil society will risk arrest, and the rest of us will pretend to be surprised when the ruling party wins again, by 98% perhaps, just to show progress. You have to hand it to CCM. They've mastered the art of modern African politics. Hold elections often enough to look democratic, control them tightly enough to stay in power, and surround yourself with just enough regional allies who value trade routes over truth. It's a delicate balance, like juggling grenades with a smile. And President Samia Suluhu Hassan has done it gracefully. Her 97.66% win isn't a number, it's a message. We can do this forever. So yes, Tanzania held an election. Yes, there were ballots, observers, speeches, and even reports. But in the end, it was less about who won and more about who dared to pretend it mattered. The AU and SADC can keep writing their polite reprimands. The rest of us will keep writing jokes. Because sometimes satire is the only way left to tell the truth. And as long as African leaders keep treating democracy like an inheritance rather than a responsibility, shows like Second Take will never run out of material. Because in this continent of eternal incumbents, the only thing that changes every 5 years is the font on the ballot paper. Just now, we talk about Donald Trump and Nigeria. On November 1, America's president and undisputed king of delusion, Donald "Don't Talk About Jeffrey Epstein" Trump, declared that he had ordered the Pentagon to prepare for possible action in Nigeria, a country that most of his followers could not locate on a map without confusing it with Niger. And for the love of Christ, do not ask MAGA members to pronounce Niger. Anyway, Trump's team claims Christians are under existential threat from jihadist violence in Nigeria, a phrase that sounds like it was picked up at a Texas megachurch barbecue rather than a State Department briefing. For context, Nigeria is roughly half Christian, half Muslim, and entirely tired of being lectured about religion by a man whose grasp of foreign policy extends to the borders of his own golf course. The announcement followed his October 31 designation of Nigeria as a country of particular concern under the International Religious Freedom Act, the bureaucratic equivalent of giving a timeout to a sovereign nation. Nigeria briefly wore this badge of dishonor back in 2020 before it was lifted in 2023 to patch up bruised diplomatic egos. But now Trump, in his infinite theological wisdom, has revived it like a bad sequel. The move was cheered by U.S. evangelical and right-wing groups who see African politics as an extension of their Sunday sermons and who insist, without irony, that Jesus himself would endorse American airstrikes. African critics, however, have called the whole thing inflammatory information, which is diplomatic speak for nonsense. But Trump, undeterred, claimed that radical Islamists were responsible for a mass slaughter of Christians, quoting unverified numbers like a preacher collecting offerings. Thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands killed. These claims were echoed by Senator Ted Cruz, who never met a moral panic he didn't like, and Congressman Tom Cole, who described Nigeria's situation as ongoing persecution, the sort of label Americans apply to countries they don't understand but want to bomb anyway. The facts, as verified by people who actually live on Earth and read, tell a more complicated story. Boko Haram and ISWAP have indeed killed more than 35,000 people since 2009, most of them Muslim civilians who had the audacity to oppose extremism. In 2025 alone, over 3,100 Nigerians of all faiths have died in conflicts driven by terrorism, ethnic rivalries, and land disputes. Not holy war. But nuance has never been Trump's love language. To him, Nigeria is a movie, a dusty frontier where good Christians face evil jihadists and only an orange savior can ride in with guns ablazing to save them. And so he announced plans to cut the roughly $1 billion in U.S. aid that Nigeria receives annually, aid that mostly funds health programs like PEPFAR, counterterrorism, and, ironically, peacekeeping. Trump says all this is punishment for Nigeria's sins, though one suspects it's more about headlines than heaven. He even suggested that American troops could be deployed to Nigeria or that airstrikes could rain down on Islamic terrorists, promising an operation that would be fast, vicious, and sweet. Sweet, like dessert after a war crime. Pentagon officials, clearly praying for early retirement, noted that there are no immediate operations confirmed, which can be translated to, "We're ignoring him until he maybe forgets." Meanwhile, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, a man who leads prayer sessions at the Pentagon and sees every conflict as a spiritual sequel to the Book of Revelation, has become Trump's prophet-in-chief. Inside the administration, evangelicals are thrilled. Trump's declaration has given them another battlefield in the crusade for clicks. But while Trump's base was clapping their hands and shouting hallelujah, Africa was not amused. Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu reminded everyone that Nigeria's 1999 constitution guarantees religious freedom, saying state-backed persecution is impossible. His spokesperson called Trump's statements a gross exaggeration, pointing out that in Nigeria's complex conflicts, both Christians and Muslims die, as do mosques, churches, and any unlucky bystanders caught between herders and farmers arguing over land or cattle. Tinubu later urged national unity, though unity is hard to preach when the world's most powerful man is threatening to liberate your citizens with missiles. The African Union called the threats inflammatory, pointing out that the Sahel doesn't need more fire. Thank you very much. ECOWAS, still recovering from coups, sanctions, and Ruto's tweets, stayed quiet, perhaps hoping silence counts as diplomacy. China jumped in to say the U.S. should stay out of Nigeria's internal affairs, and the shade was much appreciated by Africans. The irony isn't lost on anyone that the same Trump who once called African nations latrine pits, I can't say the actual word because I still need sponsors, but Trump now claims divine concern for African Christians. The entire debacle underscores one thing: the world's most powerful democracy still hasn't figured out how to differentiate faith from foreign policy. Trump's America treats religion like a weapon and Africa like a stage prop, a place for moral theater, not mutual respect. And yet, beneath all the holy thunder and Christian persecution headlines, Africans can smell something more familiar than divine inspiration: oil. Less than 2 weeks ago, Aliko Dangote announced that the Dangote refinery was set to become the biggest in the world, positioning Nigeria as an energy powerhouse capable of reshaping global supply chains and, by extension, American interests. Suddenly, Trump's righteous fury about religious freedom starts to sound like a sermon delivered from an oil rig. Maybe the existential threat isn't to Christians, but to American petrol dominance. And Trump, ever the businessman, knows that sanctimony sells better than strategy. So, while he thunders about faith, the subtext reeks of fuel. In the end, the only sweet thing about this saga is watching Africans once again school the self-appointed saviors of the West on the art of perspective. While Washington prays for optics, Abuja prays for peace, and both ironically are waiting for divine intervention to make Trump freaking log off. Zohran Kwame Mamdani, the man who makes the rest of us immigrants look like we've been wasting our visas. Born in Kampala, raised partly in Cape Town, educated in Maine, rapping in Queens, and now running New York City at 34. If ambition were a crime, this guy would be serving life without parole. The man's resume reads like a Netflix series written by an overachiever with no sense of moderation. Son of an Oscar-nominated filmmaker, student of a world-renowned scholar, rap artist, socialist, and apparently a mayor who quotes Nehru and drops Bollywood bangers in the same breath. He's the first Muslim, first South Asian, first African-born, and youngest mayor of New York since 1892. Basically, he's the first of everything that will make your African parents side-eye each one of your achievements. On election night, Zohran stood there like a man who'd just convinced an entire city to vote for philosophy homework. When he said, a city of immigrants built by immigrants, powered by immigrants, and as of tonight, led by an immigrant, he didn't just win an election, he turned immigration paperwork into political poetry, which makes sense because Zohran's life has more layers than a border control form. Born to Indian Ugandan parents, raised in post-apartheid South Africa briefly and perfected in New York, he's been black, brown, and mustard. Yes, mustard. That's what he told his kindergarten teacher when asked if he was white, black, or colored. The man was rejecting boxes before the rest of us learned to fill them in correctly. By 7, he was in the Bronx, where he learned to juggle Hindi, Urdu, Spanish, English, and probably an intricate understanding of rent increases. When Columbia University said no, he said fine. He went to Bowdoin College, studied Africana Studies, and co-founded a pro-Palestine group, and basically graduated summa cum laude in causing useful trouble. He didn't join the Ivy League, he declared independence from it. And those parents. If ever there was a pair that made therapy unnecessary but rebellion inevitable, it's Miraneh and Mahmoud Mamdani. She's the Indian film legend behind Monsoon Wedding and Mississippi Masala. He's the Ugandan academic who writes about genocide before breakfast and lectures colonialism into submission. They met in Uganda, fell in love over post-colonial theory, and created a son who could probably direct your biopic and fact-check your revolution in one sitting. Denzel Washington literally held baby Zohran. So yes, the man has had star power since the cradle. Their living room was a mix of film sets, protest posters, and doctoral dissertations. Mira taught him that no box is big enough. Mahmoud taught him that every box was colonial anyway. In that house, family dinner probably came with assigned readings. But before City Hall, there was Mr. Cardamom. Because, of course, Zohran also had a rap career. The man didn't just fight inequality, he rapped about it. His 2017 EP, Sida Mukia, Easy Money, attacked landlords harder than the housing crisis itself. His hit Nani went viral in South Asian circles, and he once ran a survey on halal cut prices to expose city permit corruption. He was the only politician who could quote Marx in one bar and rhyme it with Queens Boulevard in the next. His day job? Helping immigrants fight foreclosure. His night job? Freestyling about capitalism. He's the kind of guy who'd help you fill out your rent relief form, then drop a verse about it on SoundCloud. Basically, Zohran Mamdani is the hero your landlord warned you about. Politically, he's a socialist. Think of him as socialism with sneakers and a Spotify playlist. As a proud member of the Democratic Socialists of America, he's been calling for free buses, rent freezes, and taxes on elite universities, because if Harvard's going to charge $80,000 a year, it might as well pay for your train ride. His whole campaign ran on 3 words: for the many. And when the billionaires clutched their pearls, he just smiled and promised to tax the pearls too. He turned his city council speeches into viral videos, his rallies into block parties, and his platform into a mixtape of hope for working class immigrants. But every folk hero needs his villains, and Zohran got 2 of the best. Andrew Cuomo, politics' favorite comeback addict, crawled out of retirement and his multiple sexual misconduct cases to stop him, armed with rich friends, bad advice, and the smugness of a man who's been governor 3 times. Cuomo called him divisive and unrealistic, which in politician speak means he's cooler than me. He even tried an independent run after losing the Democratic primary by 12 points, because quitting isn't part of his vocabulary. Just ask the ladies he allegedly harassed. His campaign went full fear mode, warning that the city would collapse under socialism while collapsing in the polls. Then, of course, there was Donald Trump, the president who still can't resist inserting himself into anything with a camera. He called Zohran a radical socialist, lunatic, and a Jew hater, threatened to cut $18 billion in federal funds, and said he'd send troops if New York didn't behave. Because what's democracy without a side of threats? Trump even endorsed Cuomo, turning the race into a bizarre political buddy comedy. When that failed, he went on Truth Social to declare, "And so it begins," which is exactly what everyone said when he lost the last election. Zohran's response: "Donald Trump, since I know you're watching, turn the volume up." It was the political version of "Hold my chai." The beauty of Mamdani's win is that it's not just about one city. It's about every immigrant who's ever been told they were too foreign to lead. His rise says to the world, you don't have to be born into privilege to lead. Sometimes you just need Wi-Fi, rhythm, and rage. And that's why, across the diaspora, we are grinning like proud aunties at graduation, because Zohran Mamdani isn't just the mayor of New York, he is the mayor of every African immigrant who ever hustled 2 currencies at once. He's proof that the African dream doesn't stop at London, Toronto, or Dubai. It can stretch all the way to City Hall, from Kampala to Queens, from Mr. Cardamom to Mr. Mayor. He's shown that an immigrant's hustle can outshine an empire's inheritance. And if his opponents are still licking their wounds, maybe they should try a little mustard. It goes well with humble pie. That's been Second Take. Good night.